Hey, can everybody hear me okay? All righty, very good. So I'm Elli Sparks, and I'm the Director of Field Development, which is kind of a play on words, but really my real job is starting up new chapters, and I am in love with the Agriculture Committee. That's one of our action teams that has subcommittees, the Farm Bureau and Commodity Growers. We briefly had a little organic committee. We have rural electric co-ops, kind of an offshoot of that. And I'm also a farmer, a small farmer. We have 111 acres in central Virginia. We rotational graze our animals, sort of polyface farm style through our property, and sell at the farmer's market. And we have raw milk. I have some up in a cooler, but anyway. And so today the panel here is attempting to look at the question of what happens to agriculture, to farmers, once carbon fee and dividend goes into play, and how might farmers respond to that reality, to the reality of climate change. How might their farming change? What happens if they don't change their farming, maybe if they just tighten their belts a little bit rather than making some big shifts. And so we have three panelists who are going to be helping to answer those questions for us. Ideally, that will give us some tools when we're meeting with our members of Congress. If we're from farming districts, I would contend that every state has senators who are farming senators, because we're growing something in every state in this country. And I want to tell you a little bit about our three speakers. So Pietro Emilio Spini is first. Isn't that a beautiful name? You can tell he's from an exotic land. He has lived and studied in Milan, Italy. And while at, and I probably won't say this right, Bocconi, you can correct me, University, he participated in an exchange program with Cornell. So that's what brought him here to the US. That has introduced him to education and research in the US. He is fascinated by the vast opportunities offered by research institutions, and so he's going to pursue an academic career in economics. He is a student at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell. He will start his PhD program in economics at the University of California, San Diego. So if anyone's from the San Diego chapter, they should snatch him up next fall. He's interested in research on carbon pricing and wants to develop tools for the analysis of carbon taxation policies. And he's been recently working on forecasting the cost of carbon taxation on US agriculture. So that's his expertise, and that's what he's going to bring to the table today. And then we have Dr. David Wolf. So where are you, Dr. Wolf? Over here. He will be second on our list. He's a professor of plant and soil ecology in the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell University. In addition to peer-reviewed research publications, he has co-authored numerous climate change studies for policymakers, including the 2008 and 2014 U.S. National Climate Assessments. He currently leads a USDA project focused on carbon, nitrogen, and greenhouse gas management in agro-ecosystems, and contributes to soil conservation and food security projects in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Kenya. You might want to go talk to our groups in Africa when you're over there. We've got groups over there. At Cornell, he teaches climate change and the future of food, and is one of the founding organizers of Cornell's Soil Health Program. He's also author of the award-winning popular science book on soil ecology, Tales from the Underground, a natural history of subterranean life. And then our third speaker is Peter Lehner. Where are you? There he is. Who recently rejoined Earth Justice to focus on efforts to make our food system healthier for people and our environment. He previously served as the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council, where, among other things, he built up the advocacy to reduce food waste and end the routine use of antibiotics in animal feed. Before that, woohoo, yes, exactly. Peter was chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York Attorney General's Office, where he led a major multi-state cases challenging air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. Earlier, Peter started the Environmental Prosecution Unit of the New York City Law Department. He's an honors graduate of the Harvard College and Columbia Law School. So those are our panelists. Put that on.
Like here, maybe?
Yeah.
How does this sound? Is that all right? All right? Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So I would like to start by saying that this is my first conference that is in a non-academic setting, so please be nice to me. And also on a related note, if I delve too deep into the econ jargon, please feel free to ask me questions and clarifications in the end. So, as Elli said, I'm a graduate student at Cornell University. Therefore, I'm working on the impact of carbon taxation on the U.S. crop farms. Therefore, the nice match between the alignment between what CCL has been advocating to do with fee and dividend and what I'm interested. So I would like to thank CCL for making this possible for me. It's really important to work on something that I'm so fond of. And thank you to the audience for energizing me with your enthusiasm, because it will be terrifying to talk to you if that was not the case. So thank you. So today, my presentation would talk about the impact of carbon taxation on U.S. crop farms. We're going to jump into the question by, maybe I should do this. Yeah. We're going to jump right into the question of what would happen to U.S. farms if fee and dividend was applied as a carbon policy. So this is not a new question to the economic literature. As a matter of fact, there are two big frameworks that address the question, maybe not with the same setting of fee and dividend, maybe not on U.S. territory, but it's definitely not new. In particular, these two settings are microeconomic models and general equilibrium models. We're going to see basically a couple of strengths and weaknesses of both. For general equilibrium models are models that encompass the whole economy and try to predict what happens to the whole economy when a carbon tax, or fee, I should say, is implemented. So the strength is obviously the fact that they're complete, because they treat they're very complex. They take into account the intricacies and the relations between different sectors of the same economy, and they're trying to predict the effect on the whole economy. At the same time, this appears to be a weakness for our purposes, because they cannot carefully predict what happens to the farm level impact. Because farms in the US are so heterogeneous, so that is to say, they're very, very different in terms of region where they're located, in terms of crop that they grow and harvest, and in terms of size. So, you can think about, in the economic side, purchasing power, and so on. Another weakness of these models is that they're computationally exhaustive. So they absorb a lot of information, and they take a long time to design and implement. So that is definitely beyond the scope of a master thesis, for example. The antagonist to this approach is the mathematical programming models that are grounded in the micro data, so in the farm level data. These models, they restrict the analysis to only a few variables and at the farm level. So they're able to predict with a certain level of detail and mathematical rigor what is happening when a fee is introduced at the farm level. So they serve our purpose on the one hand. On the other hand, they require some parameters that are usually drawn from previous studies in the literature. So they tend to grow obsolete real easily. This is one of the major drawbacks. Additionally, these models, because of their neat and simple setting, they often impose too many simplifications and restrictions on the subject matter. So they wash away a lot of the complexity that we're still interested in. How our research is trying to change how does it locate between these two main frameworks? So the objective is not new in a sense. We're trying to forecast what is the effect of a given level of carbon taxation. So in this case, we're going to start with $15 per ton of carbon equivalent, exactly what CCL has been advocating for. But it is a data-based approach, because it uses econometric data from USDA Agricultural Resource Management Survey and USDA price level data. For our methodology, bear with me into the economics, we model a representative farm. So we say farms are likely to differ across regions and crop types. So for each combination of crop type and region, we choose to model what would happen to a farm that grows that crop mostly and is located into that region. And then we compare across regions and crops to see whether crops and regions effectively react differently to the carbon tax. We model this using biophysical information on the carbon equivalent content of each of the 3 major nutrients in fertilizers, so nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and fuel, of course. And we test them under 3 different tax scenarios. One that is really mild, introductory year, so $15 per ton of carbon equivalent, and then 2 very, very high tax scenarios. What are the advantages of our approach? The fact that it's grounded in data, so it uses real farm data to forecast something that otherwise we will have no means to observe. In fact, a carbon tax in the US has never been implemented, so there is no other way through which we can address the question. In British Columbia, for instance, in Canada, it has been implemented, so there is data for that. But, US and Canada are quite different. So there are underlying assumptions that I should mention because, the tip of the balance will be on these underlying assumptions. So we assume that there is no variation in the capital structure. So there is no purchase of new climate smart technology, for instance. There is no purchase of more fuel efficient technology and so on. There is no adaptation through farm practices. So in a sense, farmers are myopic in this model. They choose to just, tilt a little bit the demand for fuels, for fertilizers, for labor, but they don't change their underlying practice. And we also assume that the major drivers of heterogeneity among farms, so the diversity among farms, can be carefully explained by the regional differences and the crop differences. Okay? So what are the indicators that we're using to understand what is the effect on our farms? So we're using the percentage cost increase. That is defined as the change in total variable cost after my tax is hitting me, with respect to the variable cost that I was already bearing as a farm. So with respect to the baseline, when there is no tax, when the tax is effectively 0. Then we're also registering what is happening to the fuel cost share and the fertilizer cost share that are somewhat self-explanatory. They are the total expenses for fuel with respect to the total expenses, and the total expenses for fertilizer with respect to the total expenses. So in the following map, I think there is on the handout in your app, you can also there is a box that explains how to read this map, but I will do it for you. On this map, there are 3 numbers registered, 3 pieces of information per region. The first one tells us what is the percentage change in the total cost structure that is caused by a tax of $15 per ton of carbon equivalent. So our tax year 1, the introductory tax. 4 different regions, and in particular, this is for corn. So the crop that we're selecting right now, we're zooming on corn. And then the other 2 numbers are telling us whether or not, whether the farm is bearing a higher total cost for fuel and fertilizer, or maybe if they're deciding to purchase less than proportionally with respect to how much the price change, or if they're switching throughout. So maybe they'll be spending more for fuel and less for fertilizer. So in this case, for instance, when corn is grown in the mountain region, which is the red one right there, the total cost goes up by only 3.25%. So that's a very mild impact. These numbers by themselves are not that informative, but if we compare them with what happens to soybean, for instance, we're able to gather some insight of how this tax is going to affect farms quite differently. So for soybeans, we observe that in general, wherever soybeans is grown, the effect on soybeans is much lower than the effect, almost half as much of what is the effect on corn. That is to say that soybean farms are going to be able to react much better to this carbon tax, at least at this introductory level, than what corn farms are. In particular, in the delta states, the pink region right there, the effect of a carbon tax is almost nil. So I'm sure you guys can guess that a very big driver of this, disparaging situation between corn and soybeans is the fact that soybeans are nitrogen fixers. So in that sense, the price of nitrogen that is increased by the tax, because nitrogen releases carbon equivalent, in fact, it's one of the major drivers of one of the highest carbon equivalent content. Soybeans don't need as much nitrogen as corn does. So therefore, the tax is going to be much milder on them. We report also cotton, but let me get to wheat, because there's something interesting happening in wheat. So if we look at the Pacific region or the northern plains, which are respectively the purple and the brown region, we observe that, at a absolute level, the cost that is borne by wheat farms is in between soybeans and corn. So there must be some underlying structure that drives this change. But in the Pacific, the wheat farms trade between fuel and fertilizer. So they end up being less fertilizer expensive and more fuel expensive. That is to say that in their decision on what is the input to use, they decrease their use of fertilizer. They're more efficient in using fertilizer, which suggests that maybe they were never that efficient to begin with. So what we're going to look at right now is a much higher level of taxation. So this should not scare you because it happens only 9 years. So we have at least 9 years of life between this scenario and the present moment. So here we report for each combination of crop type and region, what is the percentage change in cost? So for a minute, we forget about fuel and fertilizer. We see that we label the effect a mild effect of the tax if the total increase in cost is below 10%. We label it medium impact if it's between 10 and 30%, and we label it strong impact if it's above 30%. Now, why do we care about labeling mild, strong, or intermediate? Because if it's a strong impact, we expect some of our underlying assumption, so the capital structure, the fixation of the capital structure, to be violated. That is to say, farms will not be driven out of business. Before they will decide to revolutionize their capital structure, that is to say, purchase more climate-smart technology, for instance, or change their tillage practices, and so on. We see that for a tax of $100, the only combination that is severely hit is corn farms in the Appalachian. What happens when we raise the tax to $200? A very extreme case that will only happen in 16 years. Well, we see that the severe impact that characterized Appalachian corn has spread across our table. So now, not only Appalachian corn farms have to change drastically, but also pretty much every corn farm has to change drastically, and some of the soybeans and cotton and wheat farms as well. So an important note that we should make is that more instructive than the fact that we have an estimate for how much the cost changes, we have a policy implication on which are the farms that are most likely to oppose our policy, to oppose the fee and dividend policy. So farmers are very aware of their cost structure. In fact, cost decisions are the most basic decision that a farmers make in the economic modeling of it, I should say. But so if we want to target efforts at advocating and implementing this policy, well, the first target should be the farms that bear the heaviest cost because they're the most likely to oppose it. What are the takeaways of this model? Well, initial fees were fine. Initial fees do not have a large impact on farm profitability, so they're likely to be welcome, to an extent, but not opposed by any farm combination. Corn farms in general face the largest increase in cost. So corn farms are the target of our action. And then the last thing, which is somewhat a mathematical fact, but it's very important to note, is the fact that a fee of to $100 is so disruptive to the farm structure, and disruptive in a way that I want to qualify it right now, is so disruptive in the sense that it calls for a complete change of farm practices an adaptation that cannot travel only on the readjustment of the level of labor, that, like how many workers I want to employ, or how much fuel I want to purchase to drive my tractor, or how much fertilizer I'm willing to spread on my field. So these are minor decisions now. I have to restructure my decision process with much larger decisions that take into account capital and land. So, how does the scenario change under adaptation and mitigation? It's an open question for this model. This model is blind to that. So I'm actually really happy that the other two speakers are going to talk thoroughly about what these hopeful solutions are, because the future is grim otherwise. Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Great. All right, here comes David. And let's put you on.
Is that going to work all right for sound? Yes. Okay, let me see if I can find my PowerPoint here. Yep, that would, oops. And I think we are ready to go. Okay, so first I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I've heard about this organization before, but never felt the energy in the room like I've felt today, and just fantastic stuff that you folks are doing. So really excited to witness it, and I'm going to take the message back to the people I know working in this realm. A couple things just on this first slide. I've got a couple of websites there. So Cornell has a climatechange.cornell.edu website filled with resources for all kinds of stakeholders. And if you go to the resource button, you'll see a whole list of things for agriculture. There's also stuff for natural resource managers, communities, students, et cetera. I did bring about 20 copies of one of the fact sheets we have there on focus just on agriculture mitigation for a few of you interested, but I can also provide that PDF to the organization for future reference. Also, it was mentioned in my introduction that I'm very involved in Cornell's, quote, soil health program. And I'll be talking more about that in my presentation. And that too has a website with lots of resources about managing our soils better. So farmers, they're already feeling the effects of climate change. Some of them, in this country at least, still not comfortable maybe using the phrase climate change, but they're talking about strange weather, bad weather, things their grandparents and parents never saw before. And they're having, lots of challenges with this. First of all, weather's always been a challenge for farmers, so they want to know, is this, quote, normal bad weather, or is this really some kind of trend that's very different than we've ever seen before, that I really need to go to the bank, take out a loan, make some kind of investment to adapt to this? If it's getting drier, maybe I need to buy irrigation equipment, that costs me something, or put in better drainage systems, or both, and when do I do that? And this is, I think, a role for universities and government agencies. At Cornell, we have an Institute for Climate Change and Agriculture, all about decision tools for farmers, making those very, very tough decisions. And it's not easy business decisions in that kind of framework of uncertainty, just adapting to climate change. Before we I'll talk, most of my talk will be about mitigation, but I want to say a couple things about adaptation. I just came back from Kenya, where they're dealing with just rainfall challenges, both too much and too little water like they've never seen before. And there's very little politicization of climate change, and farmers are all very just concerned about and getting all the help they can to cope with it. But as you know, in this country, it's been very politicized, and farmers tend to be a conservative group. We heard this morning about communicating with conservative groups, and I've been communicating with farmers for all of my career. I think I know them pretty well, and I've got a few, our own Cornell Cooperative Extension team has been in the past a bit reticent about talking to farmers about this for fear of the reaction. And this is kind of my slide I often show to them about how to begin that engagement. So I'm just sharing this with you. First of all, I've never met a farmer anywhere in the world, including anywhere in the US, who's not concerned about extreme weather events and uncertainty about the weather. So that's one way to get them talking about climate change. If you were a group of farmers here, if I said, what about climate change? There might be some people not want to talk about it, but I said, let's talk about the weather and weird weather and extreme weather. Hands would go up and everybody would be talking about it for 2 hours. So that's a place to get people interested. Farmers are very concerned, like I said in my previous slide, they're very baffled by what of the strange weather I'm seeing is part of a climate change trend, or what is just a normal weather pattern. They don't want to change the crops they're growing, obviously, if it's just a one-year fluke, that kind of thing. So that's a big issue. Now, in the mitigation end, it's more complex, and I'll start with the positive angle on engaging farmers about reducing greenhouse gases and all of that. Farmers are very into energy efficiency. Farmers went to diesel engines decades ago before any of us were talking about climate change because it saved them money. They're more energy efficient. And farmers and you can go to the Corn Belt and you'll see farmers like in Iowa using solar panels. It worked out economically for them, and they're getting energy, supplementing their energy needs. So they're very interested in energy efficiency and in renewable energy. They're all about that. They are, however, concerned about future energy and climate change policies and what that might mean for them. So if you talk about the carbon fee and dividend that we just heard about, their immediate concern is we're going to bear the whole brunt of this burden of solving the world's climate change problem. It's going to make it more expensive for us. I'm going to have to invest in this and that to deal with these new carbon taxes, and that's not going to get the consumers who are eating the food I'm growing are not, we're going to either have to raise food prices or I'm going to go out of business. So they're very paranoid about that. So they need some, you have to handle that gently. And my discussion, I have a lot of farmer friends, and I simply say don't be paranoid about it, get into the dialogue so that as these policies are implemented, they make sense for your operation and for food prices for everybody in the country, in the world, and it works out right. More specifically about farmer attitudes, this is to my knowledge, the most comprehensive and best done survey of U.S. farmers, or farmers anywhere actually, to date. This is almost 5,000 farmers from about 6 states in the Midwest Corn Belt. This wasn't cherry picking small organic farmers who tend to be concerned about climate change. This is the big corn soybean belt guys. And you can look at this positively or negatively, this bar graph. Basically, I look at the lower right bar, and it shows that only 4% checked the box in the survey saying they absolutely are convinced there is no climate change going on. So my feeling is, and what I'd say to our extension people, the other 96% you can talk to. Now, that's not saying they all are totally convinced and that they all think humans are the major factor. If you look at the details, the two left bars collectively, 66% of farmers are convinced climate change is occurring, but not all of those are convinced humans are the primary actor in that. And then some of them feel like they're open to the discussion, but they're not convinced of the evidence yet. But anyway, I think that's where I think this really represents, just anecdotally from my own observations, a lot of farmers in the US in terms of where they break down. So mitigation, farm energy use efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration. CH4 there represents methane, and N2O represents nitrous oxide, two very potent greenhouse gases, more potent than CO2 on a molecule per molecule basis. I'll talk a little bit about those. There's the CO2 from the tractor driving, and et cetera, et cetera. What I wanted to point out is agriculture as an industry, and this is something farmers, I try to make them aware of because it's a positive for them. Unlike other industries where it's really all about reducing your emissions and how can you do that, farmers can actually, on the positive side, store carbon, can actually suck carbon dioxide out of the air via their plants growing in the photosynthesis and store some of that carbon in the soil or in the biomass of their plants. So they can actually, in a carbon price and fee and dividend sort of market, you might imagine farmers getting some credit for the carbon they're storing in their soils and biomass. Oops. I wanted to talk about, mention before we even get to the farm, we have to think about the kind of full life cycle analysis of the carbon footprint of agriculture. And some of it has to do with the energy embedded in the manufacture of some of the inputs to farming. So this is the pie chart done several years ago by EPA of farm energy use by source. And you can see, there's a lot of diesel tractor driving going on is a big part of the pie. But notice that fertilizers actually exceed, in terms of the CO2 emissions, the CO2 emissions with the manufacturing of fertilizers exceeds the CO2 emissions associated with diesel driving tractors on the farm. So one big way that farmers can reduce their inputs, and one thing that, of course, would happen with a fee and dividend or carbon tax system is the cost of these fertilizers would go up, which would obviously create motivation for farmers to be more efficient with the use of those things. If it went to the extreme, yields could go down, food prices could go up, and we have to think about those kind of implications as well. Can you tell what this is a picture of? I'd like to show this to policymakers and see how many know what this is. Anyway, well, when I look at this, I see nitrogen, carbon, and energy. I don't know what you see. But I tell my students, like in my cropping systems ecology class, that the last generation of ag scientists and farmers did a great job of decoupling animal and crop production systems for scale of production and economic incentives and reasons. Now it's their job to figure out how we're going to recouple these for our environmental issues, and such as climate change, and still make it profitable to be a farmer. So I want to say something about soil health. I mean, when you grow crops, particularly if you're just monocropping year after year, no matter where you are, no matter how good your soils are to begin with, they begin to degrade. And the degradation, it's a long, complicated story. We've got, I could teach a whole course on this. But the biggest aspect of this is the decline in organic matter over time. And organic matter is hugely important. The soil organic matter is very important to the water holding capacity of soil and its drainage capacity. So it's really an adaptation strategy to climate change to maintain your soils healthy with good high organic matter, because that makes you more resistant to short-term droughts and flooding. And as I mentioned earlier, it so happens that organic matter is about 60% carbon typically, even higher in many cases. So that's carbon. Where would that carbon be otherwise? It would be in the air as CO2. So it's both a mitigation, it's one of these real win-win strategies. I've got up here the techniques for doing this. Reducing tillage, reducing plowing helps to slow down the breakdown of organic matter by microbial activity. And also, of course, that's reducing your fuel bills and CO2 emissions associated with that. Keeping vegetation cover on the ground year-round, using manures, compost, and using more perennial crops in the system. Specifically about nitrogen management, legumes, beans and peas and these kind of crops, and vetches, cover crops like that fix nitrogen, provide kind of, you might say, free nitrogen to the farming system, are one way to get away from synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and avoid that cost, that part of the carbon footprint with farming, because synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is very energy intensive to produce. But I wanted to point out that all nitrogen fertilizers, even if you're organic farmer, you're strictly using manure, roughly about 1% of the nitrogen in that manure doesn't go to your crop. It ends up being degraded in the degradation process in the soil. It gets lost as nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So that's another piece. So whether you're using manure or synthetic nitrogen fertilizers to be efficient in your nitrogen fertilizer application is a huge part of the solution, the way that farmers can mitigate. In fact, when you look at the pie chart for US agriculture, and agricultural emissions on a CO2 equivalent basis, you can see CO2 is the smallest piece of the pie, the actual tractor driving on the farm. This does not include actually the energy embedded in chemical inputs, I should say. But this is just talking on a farm level basis. But nitrous oxide from nitrogen fertilizer use and methane from ruminant animals, and also manures, wet manures, and rice production, and wet soils, give off methane. So you can see the breakdown there. So we don't want to just entirely focus on CO2. These other ones are important as well. In terms of the nitrogen, there's a lot of work a lot of exciting stuff going on these days. And I'll just, I guess, brag about one that Cornell's got. A colleague of mine, Harold Van Ness, has been the leader on this, but I've been involved developed a tool for farmers. It's now a phone app. We've released it. It's now commercially available. It's no longer really Cornell's. It's available in 26 states, thousands of farmer trials. The most conventional of conventional farmers have signed on to this. It reduces their nitrogen inputs and reduces their nitrogen fertilizer costs. Basically what this does is it includes in it real-time weather is fed into the system. It includes a model that models what's happening in the soils and the crop during the growing season, day by day, feeding in real-time weather. And it takes into account the freeing up of nitrogen in the soil by soil microbial activity. And the more of that, quote, free nitrogen a farmer's getting, the less nitrogen they have to apply. So that's a big way. In almost all cases, it saves farmers money and no negative impacts on yield at all. This is showing a recent, this is on the left here, I'm just kind of summarizing a paper in Nature by some of my colleagues involved in the project that was mentioned that we're all working on, carbon and nitrogen management in agroecosystems. And the bottom line there is that worldwide, there's the potential for offsetting 1/4 to 1/2 of annual human atmospheric increases in CO2 for at least a few decades by the following laundry list of activities in terms of our agroecosystems. The soil carbon piece I already kind of described to you, those methods. Rice management is included, manure management, reducing deforestation, all that biomass in trees. We don't want to let that go back up into the air as CO2. And then using agroforestry and what we call integrated landscape management, looking even beyond the farm. The right-hand graphs are from the recent IPCC study looking at different market prices for carbon, and the mitigation potential, obviously, for agriculture and forestry goes up the better the market price is for carbon. So anything we can do to begin moving those carbon markets so they're really a reality and that they're priced what they're really worth can obviously stimulate mitigation. But there's significant potential in just the agriculture and forestry sector. So integrated landscape management, this is kind of some new thinking where we're really moving, and as an ecologist, I'm very interested in this myself, moving beyond just looking at things at strictly the farm scale, looking at the full landscape scale, looking at forested areas next to farm areas, next to habitat protected areas, next to urban centers, looking at that full landscape, getting all the stakeholders involved to have a dialogue about what's our overall carbon footprint, but beyond even the climate change and carbon issues, what's our overall use of resources, water, et cetera, and how do we work on identify synergies among each other and minimize trade-offs and compromises that make one sector unhappy and the others not, to benefit each other via this kind of system. Just one graphic on, I've mostly focused on crops, but as I think you all know, ruminant animals, and most particularly in terms of what we eat, cows, are a big part of the carbon footprint of agriculture because of the methane emissions, in addition to the crops that have to be grown to feed them or the pastures, et cetera. It does make a lot of difference, of course, how the livestock are raised. There's sustainable rotational grazing systems that actually store a lot of carbon in the roots of the grasslands and kind of compensates in some ways for the methane emissions of cows. But this does affect and makes us think about what we eat as consumers. And I did want to, just in my last couple slides, talk about it is a whole food system. We can't leave farmers dangling out there by themselves thinking they're going to solve the problem. I focus mostly on the upper green bubble there, planting, growing, and harvesting crops, but there's processing, there's distribution, transport, there's access and preparation, there's consumption, where I think everybody here consumes food, and then there's a huge food waste story that I don't have time today to get into. So my last slide is just a role for all of us, a role for consumers. And it's quite, I'm really encouraged by what is happening in terms of, for example, we're working with, and we're not the only ones, talking to Walmart, that's become actually the biggest food retailer in the world. And they're getting pressure from consumers, that's not coming out of their own wishes, I think, to bring in food items that are being grown more sustainably, have a smaller carbon footprint, in all of this. When they did an analysis of all their foods in their Walmart stores, they saw that the biggest part of the food issue was actually this nitrogen issue, which is why they're talking to us about the adapt-in nitrogen thing. But there's other things as well. I mean, as consumers, we can also think about local foods in season. That doesn't mean if you're up where I live in Ithaca, New York, you're buying tomatoes locally in the winter because those are probably raised in a greenhouse using a lot of energy. But local foods in season is a very important thing to do, less transport. Buying foods with less packaging and waste. And then, even if you're not open to the vegetarian, vegan diet, a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, grains, and modest meat consumption is, of course, good for our health and has a huge impact on the global carbon footprint of agriculture. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
All right. All right, so Peter's going to get a slightly shortened amount of time so we can get some questions. So while Peter's talking, if you would want to write questions on any cards or pieces of paper and pass them up, we'll have those ready. And here you go.
Okay, one of the challenges of going last is, well, there's really two challenges. One, everyone has already said what I was going to say, and two, I'm standing between you and drinks. So I recognize that, so I'll try to be at least short. And really, the point is that you guys are all out there advocating for a carbon tax, and it's truly great. And I'm sort of encouraging you to think the next stage, which is right now the plan is only including the only greenhouse gas you're including is carbon dioxide. And as you just heard, there's some pretty significant other greenhouse gases out there. So I'll sort of get to that. But if you think about it, we think about food all the time. If you, my guess, by hearing the rumbling of stomachs in this room, a lot of people are thinking about food right now. But very rarely when you think about food, do you think about climate. And you guys, unlike many, are thinking about climate all the time, but not too many people who think about climate actually think about the food system very often. The Paris Agreement, which was a good step forward last fall or last winter, barely mentions agriculture and food, really only mentioning it in terms of food security being challenged by climate change. So, but it's nonetheless, it's a big contributor, as you just heard. But it's also a complicated contributor for a couple of different reasons. It's a lot more complicated than the electricity supply chain. Think about the supply chain that just went into having breakfast this morning. You might have had some eggs. You might have had some grain. Think where the different grains came from. You might have had fruit, probably fruit from 3 or 4 different states, maybe a few different countries. You probably had coffee or tea, both of which would almost be certainly imported, maybe dairy in some cheese or yogurt or some milk in your coffee or something like that. And that's just breakfast. And think about how much time we spend on the electricity system. Comparatively, it's relatively straightforward. A few big coal-fired power plants, some wires, and light bulbs. I'm oversimplifying, obviously. The point is the food system is enormously complicated, and that makes it a little harder to address. And it's also an area where the data are much less clear. It's great to think, okay, there's 854 coal-fired power units or something. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different types of farms. And pulling the data together on that is very complicated. And our food system, of course, is much more international. A lot of our food is imported, and as opposed to our electricity, which is generated here. So all of that said, what are the climate harms of the food system? When we were trying to think about this, we realized part of what you mean, the challenge is to think, what do you mean by the food system? So we start with the farm itself. And I start with roughly what goes on at the actual farm, and there's crop production, and there's animal agriculture. Roughly speaking, it's about half-half, and as you just heard, crop production, a big driver there is nitrous oxide. We'll talk about that more in a minute. In animal agriculture, a big of the challenge there is methane. But that's not the whole food system. You actually, as you heard, fertilizer production, which is upstream, is very energy intensive. And if you add the emissions from that on, you get a more significant overall piece. If you add on a few additional ones of the agriculture itself, such as the on-farm energy use, which is actually relatively small, and some of the loss of cropland soils, you get a few more carbon emissions. If you add the rest of the supply chain, particularly processing and transporting, processing more so than transporting, you start getting even more emissions out there. Now you're shifting more in this area to CO2 from energy use because your processing uses a lot of heating, cooling, crushing, mixing, et cetera. And then you keep going. After all, food is usually delivered to your home. In your morning cup of coffee, by far the biggest element of the greenhouse gas footprint of that cup of coffee is boiling the oil, boiling the water, I mean, rather than the transport of the coffee. And then, of course, sadly, we throw away about 40% of the food that is grown, and that is both a waste of all those upstream resources, and food is also the largest component in municipal landfills where, under most circumstances, it releases more methane. So if you add all of that up, it becomes about 20 or 25% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And that doesn't even include the food we import. You've heard a lot from other sources, I'm sure, of, say, deforestation in Indonesia for palm oil or deforestation in Brazil for beef. If you add those emissions up and recognize that those are really part of the US footprint because it's our food, the proportion of greenhouse gases is even higher. And of course, in other countries around the world where they have a smaller power sector and a smaller transportation sector, the portion of greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector is even larger. So the bottom line is, it's complicated and it's big. Don't forget it. You heard David talk some about the other greenhouse gases, and I'll just really try to go somewhat quickly since we're at the end of the day and I'm to some extent covering the same territory. But it's important to recognize that when you're thinking the food system, it is primarily other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. Methane has been getting a lot of attention recently because EPA is trying to address methane from the oil and gas sector. You might have seen, or following that news, that for a while it's a political challenge, really, because how can EPA address methane from the oil and gas sector when, in fact, methane from the agriculture sector is probably a bigger overall emitter? And then recently it was turned out maybe oil and gas is a teeny bit bigger, but they're both quite significant. And so, but the political reality of dealing with methane from agriculture is a lot tougher than dealing with methane from the oil and gas sector, which is pretty used to being regulated. But if you think about it, methane emissions are a significant part of our greenhouse gas footprint, and the methane emissions from the agriculture sector are a big chunk of that. It is particularly challenging because of the way those emissions are released from just cows, what are called politely enteric emissions, and their waste, also on the fields, and of course it's more so in feedlots, and those are tough technologically in terms of how do you address those. In a slightly different circumstance, when I was working for the city of New York, we were trying to protect our upstate water supply from, among other things, cows wandering into streams that fed into our drinking water reservoirs, and that wasn't a good thing if you drink that water. And the upstate farmers got very upset at the idea that the downstate city slickers would have anything to do with it. So they ran billboards of pictures with cows with diapers on and saying, this is the city's view of a farmer. And so it's complicated. Nitrous oxide, as you heard again from David, is largely because you put a lot of fertilizer onto your field and it doesn't all get absorbed in the plant. Much of it, as you probably know, runs off into the water, creating dead zones like in the Gulf of Mexico and Chesapeake Bay and estuaries around the country. But that doesn't go into the water and pollute the water or go into the plant and actually help the plant, some of that will, because of microbial action, become nitrous oxide. And that, again, nitrous oxide is a pretty significant part of US greenhouse gas emissions, maybe 6%, and the vast majority of that is from agriculture. But there is, as I mentioned, there is a chunk of emissions that come from our CO2. All those downstream systems, if you think of this Coca-Cola truck, Coca-Cola is really just corn at one point, but it's been converted into high fructose corn syrup and bubbled and added with water and transported and bottled. And you can easily imagine in that scenario, you're so far from the actual farm that all those downstream emissions become pretty significant. So, as I said, the point here is really partly just to stimulate a little bit of evening conversation. I thought originally I might say, well, you guys should include other greenhouse gases in your policies right now. And then I was told, no, don't say that. Just say that's a good next step. So when's that next step going to happen? Hopefully soon. But before, of course, you advocate for any strategy like a tax on other greenhouse gases, you have to have some sense that it's possible, because the point of this tax is to reduce emissions. This is not really a revenue-generating proposal to solve the US budget crisis. And the important thing to know, again, I'm really repeating what David was talking about and others know much more, but there is something you can do to address nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions and carbon dioxide emissions throughout the food system. There are, in fact, a lot of things you can do. You heard a lot about the idea of using what are, in some ways, old systems, intercropping, crop rotation, cover crops, mixing crops and trees. All of these types of things are remarkably effective when they're being used. They require more labor, but they do also often are able to produce as much food per acre as others. People often love to say, we can't feed the world with those techniques. It does take a little more work, but it can produce the food. One thing, by the way, that is, David again mentioned, is some will say, well, all of doing this will add to the price of food. You've probably heard all of that if we actually address climate change, it'll add to the price of electricity. And I'm sure you've all been trained to say, yes, but the price of electricity that you pay on your bill is nothing close to the true cost of electricity. The true cost of electricity includes climate change and air pollution and dead people and polluted waters and things like that, right? Well, it's the same with food. We don't pay anything close to the true cost of food. And if you just sort of a few back of the envelope calculations we've done suggest easily the true cost of food if you include the price, the healthcare cost imposed on all of us by an unhealthy food system, climate change, water pollution, soil loss, and all the rest, is easily double the price of food that you pay in the market, or more significantly more. So just like what you say about electricity, you can say the same thing about food. I will note that there was a great bit of work being done right now in California, which is trying to incorporate agriculture into AB 32, the climate change reduction plan. And they are seeing a number of methods that can reduce nitrous oxide and methane. On your personal level, David was right, don't eat so much beef, and that will probably be the best thing you can do. You can reduce CO2 throughout the system. Energy efficiency really is probably one of the biggest drivers, but you can also do a lot to increase soil carbon uptake. It's a challenge sometimes because anytime you think about offsetting a fossil release, like burning coal, with a biological sequestration, which can be reversed, it can be a little tricky, but nonetheless, there's a lot you can do at the farm level. So you guys, I know, I see that. She's okay, I'm going to be done in 2 minutes. So the point is, we're all trying to get at least down to 80%. If you look at what I'm trying to show you here is you're aiming for 80% reduction. If you ignore methane and nitrous oxide and methane, which are roughly half of the overall food system emissions, you end up making your job a little harder. You will end up having to get far more than 80% of that 80% you're letting yourself look at. And you also may create some weird disincentives, or phrased differently, incentives for behavior that are later going to be problematic if people shift from one greenhouse gas emitting activity to another. If you burn corn-based ethanol instead of gasoline, you may think, hey, that's okay because there's no greenhouse gas tax associated with that if it's just a carbon tax. You're also making perhaps your life a little more difficult. From $1 per ton of CO2e reduced, it will be a lot easier to get some of the early methane and nitrous oxide reductions out there rather than squeezing those last drops of carbon reductions. And that's it.
Awesome. All right.
So should we stay up here for questions?
All right.
Okay, I'll hand this around.
So the first question is anyone taxing transportation costs of food so that locally produced food becomes competitive? Yes, when we have the carbon fee and dividend, so that would be, I'll answer that. That would be yes. The answer to that is yes.
But can I just point out, as we both said, the transportation footprint of food is a remarkably small part of the overall carbon or greenhouse gas footprint of food.
Somebody wants a little advice on talking to the Farm Bureau in their local community in the Midwest. Any tips? Like if these farmers, like you were saying.
Well, that's interesting because I talk to the New York State Farm Bureau pretty often. We communicate with them quite a bit. But myself and Don Wobbles, a climate scientist from the University of Illinois, about 5 years ago met with the president of the Farm Bureau here in DC, the head of the whole lobby, and some of his key people, because they were putting out some stuff that was very anti-sciencey and all this. So we came with our best slides and information, and really when we started showing them the sort of story of why this was an issue, they chuckled a little bit, and they knew all that. We weren't teaching them anything. And it really came down to my third point on that early slide of mine, of they're more afraid of the policy reaction. I think they're overly paranoid about the policy reaction to climate change being bad for farmers, and not afraid enough of what the climate change challenge is going to mean for farmers. So we had a very good discussion that way. But you have to. There's concerns there. You can think of, I've had farmers say to me, I've got a $200,000 a year transportation bill. They ship all over the eastern US. And so if there's a carbon tax, it'll be $250,000. So which kid am I not going to send to college this year? Just keep that in mind in terms of where they're coming from.
Awesome, thanks. So somebody wants to know how many tons of carbon at a large scale per acre can be sequestered per year?
That can be looked up. There's a lot of evidence on that. I don't think any of us can remember it off the top of our head. But again, and you can probably speak to it, it's a lot more complicated than simply here's a number. Among other things, you can get to a certain amount and then it levels off. And another issue is that you can sequester a lot of carbon, say by using no-till, and then you start tilling the land again, and all the carbon you've sequestered is released again. And that's what I was referring to when I said there's a risk to biological sequestration and claiming it offsets burning coal, which is once it's up there, you're never going to get it back. So I think it's a complicated issue beyond just a number that none of us can remember.
That's right. Oh, okay. So just someone wanted to point out that with our policy, we're looking at fossil fuel and carbon dioxide and equivalents and greenhouse gas equivalents related to fossil fuel. We aren't looking at burping rice paddies and farting cows, but we are looking at fossil fuel and carbon dioxide and related and equivalents, carbon dioxide equivalents. So just a little clarification. And then what is the potential for reducing the economic impact of carbon fee and dividend through adaptation? So with crops, equipment, and techniques.
Well, I think, so I mean, in terms of, if the question is, how can farmers do this and not lose a lot of money, can be efficient for them? And yeah, I think that they have a lot of options as long as the measures that are implemented, the policies are not draconian as some of the options we saw from the first speaker. So I think that there's a lot that the farmers can do. They can buffer themselves from some of that. And there's definitely inefficient, like the nitrogen story, farmers, almost every farmer left to their own ways, given the current low cost of nitrogen fertilizer, they put on a lot of insurance nitrogen. And so there's a lot of room for improving efficiency there, for example, with no real cost, which is what that nitrogen tool I talked about tends to do, is make it more efficient. So there's some places where there's a lot of room for improvement without big costs.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is an econ theory that is really interesting about technology. So for technologies, sometimes technology may not be profitable to invest in the beginning. So like if there is, why is nobody creating more technology that is more climate smart or like that goes towards our target? Well, apparently there is a solution for that. The solution is to have government investments in the beginning until the price of the technology is so low, until the returns are so high that like the private sector is naturally going to invest into that. And then the measure is sustainable and it doesn't bear a heavy cost on the government because it can be withdrawn. And at that time, you have already created a dynamic effect so that like that technology is actually profitable and the cost of providing that technology to farmers will be really low. But I feel like technology is the answer to many of these questions.
All right.
I would just add that it's important to remember how heavily influenced by federal policy, the Farm Bill and others, our current agriculture system is. And a lot of that actually creates disincentives for doing things that a farmer may want to do or may think is a good thing. I was just talking to some farmers earlier today, actually. They're very draconian and rigid guidelines that are actually regulations on how you have to terminate your cover crop in order to be able to get your crop insurance. And losing crop insurance is just not an option, so farmers will often forgo doing the cover crop, even though they know it will store carbons, actually help them store water and perhaps add nutrients into the soil. So there's a lot of current disincentives in policy that we all have to figure out how to change, as well as the economic ones that are real. But the legal ones are probably easier to, well, at least in theory, easier to change than the technological ones.
Awesome. Well, that's exactly where I want to end. We're at the end right here. And so we've got a picture of what farmers are looking at, how they might be able to change. We recognize with this last comment that we won't be able to recouple animals and row crops until we change some policies. And so I always like to say carbon fee and dividend is the best first step for Congress to take. And those of us interested in agriculture need to continue this conversation so we can look at what are the steps that we need to take so we can recouple and let our farmers do what they need to be doing to be the climate heroes that only they can be, the only industry that can right now sequester the carbon at a grand scale. So thank you, the three of you, for coming in and speaking with us today, and we hope that you will continue talking with us and informing us as we move forward.